Brooklyn in the 1940s wasn't the city of glass towers and neon lights people think of today. Back then, it was a place of cracked sidewalks, crowded tenements, and the steady rhythm of working-class lives. In Bensonhurst, where Italian families gathered close, loyalty wasn't just a word, it was the thread that held every household together. Men worked long hours, women kept the home steady, and children learned early that respect mattered more than money. Sammy Gravano was one of those children. Small for his age, quiet, often in the background, but always watching. Other kids pushed past him, but he didn't push back. He learned quickly that silence gave him power. If you didn't rush, if you didn't show your hand, people underestimated you. And when they underestimated you, you could move in ways they never expected. His father worked as a tailor. Bent over the cloth day after day, he reminded Sammy that an honest life, though tiring, was the safer one. But Sammy, even young, noticed something else. The men on the corners who didn't sweat over machines. The ones in sharp suits, polished shoes, cigarettes glowing at night. They carried themselves differently. They didn't beg for respect, they commanded it. And when they walked by, even his father's needle paused. There was one night Sammy never forgot. He was just a boy sitting on the steps outside their building. The street was quiet, with only the sound of a distant radio and the faint buzz of a street lamp. A group of older kids surrounded him, ready to make him a target again. Sammy didn't flinch. He stood, small but steady, and swung back harder than they expected. The fight ended quick, and though he lost more than he won, one of the neighborhood men noticed. A man with slicked hair and a calm smile. "You've got something in you," the man said, almost like a whisper. It wasn't praise, not really. It was recognition. And Sammy, even as a boy, felt the weight of those words. Life in Bensonhurst taught him fast. You had to choose who you stood beside, and once you chose, you didn't waver. Loyalty was everything. But loyalty, he would later learn, was also a trap. Through the 1950s, Sammy grew into a young man. School didn't hold his attention. The streets did. Cars lined the curbs, deals whispered in alleyways, envelopes passed hand to hand. He learned to listen more than he spoke, to notice details others ignored. The way a man tapped his cigarette when nervous, the way voices lowered when something mattered. Silence wasn't emptiness. It was information. At home, his father scolded him, warned him about the path he was walking. "These men don't live long," he said, sewing late into the night. "They look rich, but they die young." Sammy listened, but his eyes were already elsewhere. Respect was louder than warnings. By the time he was in his 20s, Sammy had found his place among the crews that ran Brooklyn. He wasn't the loudest, wasn't the most feared, but he was steady. Men started calling him the Bull not because of his size, but because once he charged into something, he didn't stop until it was done. It was a nickname that followed him into every backroom, every bar, every whispered meeting. But behind the respect, there was always tension. The city was shifting. Other families watched the Gambinos, the Colombos, the Genoveses. Deals overlapped. Tempers sparked. Violence was never far. And in the middle of it all, Sammy learned the unspoken rule. You survive by staying loyal to the right man. That truth would guide him for decades. It would build his power, protect his family, and eventually turn against him. But in those early years, Sammy wasn't thinking about betrayal. He wasn't thinking about prison cells or courtroom verdicts. He was thinking about the next meeting, the next envelope, the next move forward. The nights were filled with smoke curling from cigars, the low hum of jukeboxes in corner bars, the scrape of chairs on wooden floors. Sammy sat in those rooms, not as a guest, but as a man being noticed. And when he spoke, finally, men leaned in, not because his voice was loud, but because it was rare. And in a world where everyone wanted to be heard, rarity was power. He didn't know it yet, but every quiet step he took was leading him closer to the day when loyalty itself would be the weapon that cut deepest. By the late 1960s, Brooklyn was a different place. The streets hummed with noise day and night, but under the surface, everything was organized. Crews controlled the docks, the unions, the corners where deals were made. And in those shadows, Sammy's role grew bigger. He wasn't just the quiet kid anymore. He was a man others trusted to handle business when things got messy. Construction became his world. It wasn't glamorous, not like the nightclubs or the gambling halls, but it was steady, powerful, and filled with money. A job here, a deal there, contracts that made buildings rise across the city. Sammy saw early on that the real power wasn't just in the gun. It was in the paperwork, the bids, the connections that decided who got paid and who didn't. He worked closely with men who respected his discipline. He wasn't reckless, didn't talk more than he needed to. If someone stepped out of line, Sammy didn't waste words. He acted, and he acted quietly. That reputation carried. Soon, when people heard the bull, they didn't think of size. They thought of certainty. At home, life was different. His wife and children gave him something solid, something untouched by the noise of the streets. Sammy liked those evenings when the table was full, when laughter filled the kitchen. For a moment, the world outside disappeared. But even there, the life followed him. A phone call during dinner. A knock at the door late at night. His children might not have known the details, but they knew their father lived by rules most people never saw. Through the 1970s, the Gambino family was shifting. Old bosses fell, new ones rose. Power was always being tested. Sammy learned to move carefully, to attach himself to the right men, but not blindly. Loyalty was his compass, but loyalty had to be earned both ways. He became close with Paul Castellano, the man at the top after Carlo Gambino passed. Castellano ran the family like a business, focusing on money, on connections, on making things look legitimate. Sammy understood it. He respected the order Castellano brought. But not everyone did. In the clubs, whispers grew louder. Some saw Castellano as too soft, too detached from the streets. Men wanted a boss who lived like them, who walked among them. And in those whispers, the name John Gotti started appearing. Sammy watched quietly. He never rushed to choose sides. He noticed the tension building, Castellano's polished style versus Gotti's street charisma. The divide grew wider with every passing year, and Sammy knew sooner or later, the split would erupt. One winter night, the city lights glowing against snow, Sammy sat in his car outside a construction site. Deals were being made inside, papers signed, money changing hands. He stared out the windshield, smoke curling from a cigarette, and thought about the path he was on. His father's words echoed, "They don't live long, these men." But Sammy had already made his choice years ago. The streets weren't just a part of his life. They were his life. And the deeper he went, the less chance there was of ever walking away. The 1980s would prove that truth. Because soon, the whispers would turn into action. And Sammy would find himself standing at the center of a storm that would decide the future of the Gambino family and his own fate. By the early 1980s, the Gambino family was sitting on top of New York. Construction rackets, unions, nightclubs, it all flowed through their hands. And at the head of it was Paul Castellano. He ran things differently than the men before him. Castellano liked business suits, dinner in quiet rooms, money that looked clean on paper. He lived in a mansion on Staten Island, far from the streets that built his empire. Sammy respected Castellano's order. He saw how steady hands could keep money flowing without constant bloodshed. But respect wasn't the same as loyalty, not when whispers spread through the crews. Some soldiers felt Castellano was too distant, too careful. He dined with businessmen while they hustled in bars and alleys. And in those whispers, one name grew louder, John Gotti. Gotti was everything Castellano wasn't. Loud, sharp-dressed, walking the streets like a king among his people. Where Castellano stayed hidden, Gotti smiled for cameras, shook hands with locals, laughed in clubs. To many in the family, that felt real. That felt like the mob they believed in. Sammy noticed the divide. In construction meetings, men spoke carefully, keeping their voices low when Castellano's name came up. In nightclubs, with music pulsing under neon lights, they dropped their guard, speaking of Gotti with admiration. The split wasn't just about money. It was about identity. At home, Sammy felt the pull. His wife asked him sometimes why he came home later, why he seemed distant at dinner. He never explained. How could he? How could he describe the pressure of watching a family split from the inside, of knowing loyalty could cost you your life if you chose the wrong side? The storm broke in December 1985. That winter was sharp, the kind that stung your face with every breath. New York was lit with holiday lights, shoppers crowding sidewalks, taxis honking through the cold. But under the cheer, there was tension so thick you could almost hear it. On December 16th, Paul Castellano and his driver pulled up outside Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown. The city was buzzing, but on that street, men were waiting. As Castellano stepped from his car, shots cracked through the winter air. His body fell onto the pavement, blood staining the snow. The boss of the Gambino family was gone in seconds. His reign ended not in boardrooms, but on a crowded New York sidewalk. The city erupted. Newspapers screamed headlines the next morning. Mafia boss slain in Midtown. Reporters swarmed the crime scene. And in the backrooms of Brooklyn, men nodded quietly. The whispers had become action. John Gotti had made his move. For Sammy, that moment was a turning point. He hadn't been one of the shooters at Sparks, but he understood exactly what the hit meant. Gotti was stepping into power, and with Castellano gone, the family had no choice but to follow. Sammy stood close by Gotti in those days, watching how he handled the sudden spotlight. Gotti smiled, charmed, shrugged off reporters who called him the Dapper Don. He wore expensive suits, slicked his hair, walked out of courtrooms with a grin when cases fell apart. To the public, he was a figure of fascination. To the men on the inside, he was a boss who ruled with both charisma and fear. But even as Sammy moved with Gotti, some part of him remembered the mansion on Staten Island, the quiet order Castellano had tried to build. He thought about how quickly power shifted, how loyalty could flip in an instant. The night Castellano died, Sammy had stared out his window at the falling snow. The city lights shimmered in silence, but he knew the streets were louder than ever. Gotti's rise wasn't just another chapter. It was the start of something bigger, something dangerous. And for Sammy, loyalty was about to be tested in ways he never imagined. After Sparks, nothing in the Gambino family looked the same. The men who once bowed to Castellano now looked toward John Gotti. And standing beside him, steady and unshaken, was Sammy Gravano. For years, Sammy had been the quiet one, the man who let others talk while he watched and calculated. But Gotti's world was different. The spotlight was always on. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, and the city learned to call him the Dapper Don. His suits were sharp, his hair perfect, his smile practiced. He didn't hide in the shadows. He walked right into them, daring the world to look. Sammy adapted quickly. He wasn't built for cameras, not like Gotti, but he learned how to stand beside him without drawing the wrong kind of attention. In courtrooms, he sat still, his hands folded, while Gotti grinned at the jurors. In restaurants, Sammy kept his voice low while Gotti laughed loud enough for the whole room to hear. They were different, but together, they made a balance. Inside the family, Gotti's rule was clear. Loyalty was demanded, and punishment was swift. Sammy became the man who carried out that order. If someone broke a rule, if someone stepped out of line, Sammy was the one trusted to fix it. Quiet, precise, final. The crews respected that. They feared it too. But outside, the world was watching closer than ever. The FBI planted wires, tapped phones, followed cars through the city streets. They wanted Gotti badly, and they saw Sammy standing close enough to reach him too. At home, life grew heavier. Sammy's wife noticed the late nights, the tension he carried in his shoulders. His children saw the headlines, the photographs of their father walking behind Gotti. Sammy tried to keep the two worlds apart, but it was impossible. His name was no longer just whispered in bars, it was printed in newspapers, broadcast on television. There were nights when Sammy sat alone in his car, the radio low, the city buzzing outside, and thought about how much had changed. Once he was just a boy on Bensonhurst steps, fighting off bullies. Now he was the underboss of the Gambino family, second only to the most famous mobster in America. But fame came with danger. Every camera flash made the walls close in tighter. Every smile Gotti gave reporters made the FBI push harder. The more the boss loved the spotlight, the more heat the family carried. And in that heat, Sammy knew men could burn. Still, loyalty held him steady. Gotti had trusted him, lifted him higher than he ever expected to go. That kind of trust couldn't be ignored. For Sammy, loyalty wasn't just a rule. It was his way of surviving, of proving that he was worth more than fear alone. But in the quiet corners of his mind, a question began to form. What happens when the spotlight grows too bright, when loyalty to one man puts everything else at risk? He didn't have the answer yet. Not then. But the walls were already listening. The wires were already recording. And the cracks in Gotti's untouchable image were starting to show. By the late 1980s, the air around Gotti wasn't just heavy with smoke from cigars and the flash of camera bulbs. It carried something harder, sharper, the quiet patience of the FBI. They had been watching for years, but now they were listening too. Tiny microphones hidden in backrooms. Wires stitched into walls. Every careless word could end up replayed in a courtroom. Sammy knew it. He had lived long enough in the life to understand that the feds never rushed. They circled, slow and steady, until the moment was right. Still, he stayed loyal. He followed Gotti into the rave night social club, into restaurants, into late-night meetings where voices dropped and men leaned close. But the rave night wasn't safe anymore. The club, with its wood-paneled walls and smell of old coffee, had been cracked open. Hidden wires captured every laugh, every whisper, every name spoken. The FBI didn't just want Gotti. They wanted the whole foundation of the Gambino family. In the recordings, something unexpected happened. Gotti, the boss who demanded loyalty above all else, began to talk. He blamed others for mistakes. He shifted responsibility. And sometimes, he spoke Sammy's name in ways that made the blood run colder than any threat on the street. One night, Sammy sat in a dim kitchen, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him, and thought about what those words meant. If the boss was willing to cast shadows on him in private, what did loyalty mean anymore? At home, the weight grew heavier. His wife tried to hold the family together, but the strain showed in the lines on her face. His children were old enough to notice the tension, to read the headlines. Sammy didn't tell them everything. He couldn't. But they weren't blind. They saw the danger creeping closer. Meanwhile, Gotti loved the stage. He walked out of courtrooms smiling, shaking hands, playing the part of a man untouchable. The papers called him the Teflon Don. Case after case slipped away, charges falling apart like sand through fingers. The public saw a king laughing at the law. But Sammy knew better. He saw the jurors who were influenced, the witnesses who vanished, the quiet money that made problems disappear. That kind of magic never lasted forever. And each time Gotti strutted out of a courtroom in his silk tie, Sammy felt the noose tighten a little more. In the back rooms, men whispered about the tapes, about what the feds might have, about who would be standing next to Gotti when the hammer finally came down. Sammy listened, silent as always, but inside, the questions grew louder. Was loyalty still survival? Or was it turning into a sentence, waiting to be carried out? One winter evening, leaving the rave night, Sammy looked at Gotti walking ahead of him, cameras flashing like lightning. The boss smiled wide, soaking it in. Sammy followed a step behind, his face calm, but his thoughts heavy. Every light on Gotti was another shadow cast over him. And in those shadows, he could feel the walls closing in. In December 1990, the walls finally closed in. Federal indictments dropped like stones, and John Gotti, Sammy Gravano, and Frank Locascio were pulled into the center of it all. The charges were heavy: racketeering, murder, conspiracy. It was the kind of case that didn't just threaten years in prison. It threatened lifetimes. Sammy sat in the courtroom, his face calm, hands folded, but inside his thoughts pressed hard against each other. The room smelled faintly of paper and polish, the hum of voices blending into the shuffle of reporters in the back rows. Gotti entered each day like it was a stage. His chin was high, his suit perfect, his smile steady. To the world outside, he was still the Teflon Don. But behind the polished wood of the defense table, Sammy saw something different. He saw the weight of the FBI's recordings stacked against them. He saw the prosecutor's eyes, cold and certain. He saw the jury, watching carefully, waiting to be convinced. And worst of all, he heard his own name on those tapes. Gotti's voice, sharp and dismissive, shifting blame, planting seeds of suspicion. The boss who demanded silence and loyalty was using words like weapons, not against their enemies, but against his own underboss. Each time the recordings were played, Sammy listened quietly, the sound seeping into him like a slow poison. Around him, lawyers whispered strategies, flipping through papers, but Sammy stayed still. It wasn't just evidence. It was betrayal, spoken in the boss's own voice. At home, the cracks grew deeper. His wife watched the news, her face pale. His children asked questions he couldn't answer. They saw the cameras outside, the reporters pushing microphones toward the family, shouting names and charges. Sammy had lived through storms before, but never one that followed him into his own living room. In his cell at night, he lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint echoes of voices down the corridor. Prison was familiar to him. He had seen it before, but this was different. This wasn't a sentence he could serve and walk away from. This was a trap with no clear exit. He thought about loyalty, about what it had given him and what it had taken. He had risen higher than most men ever dreamed, trusted by bosses, feared by soldiers. But now that same loyalty had put him on trial for his life. Some nights, he remembered the old warnings, his father's voice, tired and certain. They don't live long, these men. The words came back now, sharper than ever. Sammy's reputation was built on silence. He wasn't the man who bragged, who shouted. He was the man who acted, who stayed steady when others lost their nerve. But as the trial moved forward, as the tapes played again and again, silence felt less like strength and more like a cage. And in that cage, he started to wonder if the only way out was to do what no one ever expected. For the first time in his life, the thought of breaking silence wasn't unthinkable. It was survival. The courtroom air grew heavier with every passing day. The prosecutors didn't rush. They laid the evidence piece by piece, each recording, each witness, like bricks being stacked around the defense. And every time Gotti's voice came through those hidden microphones, the cracks widened. Sammy sat there, steady, but inside he felt it, the shift. Loyalty had always been the rule he lived by, the rule that built his name. But loyalty now sounded like a chain. The boss who once stood like iron beside him was cutting away at his own men, letting the blame fall wherever it might keep him shining. Late one night, back in his cell, Sammy closed his eyes and thought about his family. His wife, who had already endured the headlines. His children, who carried his name into schools where whispers followed them down the halls. If he kept silent, they would lose him forever. If he stayed loyal to Gotti, the man smiling in front of cameras while dragging him down in private, what would that loyalty mean in the end? The next day, when the prosecutors offered a conversation, Sammy didn't say no. He listened. He measured. And for the first time in his life, he considered stepping across a line he had sworn never to cross. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no sudden break. The decision came the way most storms do. Quietly at first, then impossible to ignore. In a small room, away from the eyes of the jury and the ears of the family, Sammy sat with federal agents. They spoke clearly, offering protection, offering a way out. In return, they wanted truth. Not half-truths, not silence. The full story. Sammy leaned forward, his hands folded, his voice even. He didn't rush. He didn't waste words. For decades, he had built his life on silence. Now, every word carried the weight of survival. He told them about meetings, about murders, about the structure that kept the Gambinos running. He gave them details only a man at his level could know. Each word was a nail in the coffin of his old life. But in that room, Sammy felt something he hadn't felt in years, clarity. He wasn't doing it for revenge. He wasn't doing it for headlines. He was doing it because loyalty had already been broken, not by him, but by the man who demanded it most. When the session ended, he sat back, silent again. The decision was made. There was no going back. John Gotti would face trial not with Sammy at his side, but with Sammy's voice as the weapon against him. And for the first time, the quiet bull had chosen a different kind of loyalty, not to a boss, not to a family, but to his own survival, and to the future of the people waiting for him at home. The trial moved into its sharpest days, the courtroom packed with reporters, the air buzzing with curiosity. Everyone wanted to see the unthinkable. Sammy, the bull, Gravano, the underboss of the Gambino family, sitting on the witness stand. He walked in steady, dressed clean, his expression calm. No flash, no grin, no silk suits like Gotti. Just a man carrying the weight of a lifetime on his shoulders. The jurors leaned forward. The press scribbled. For a moment, the entire city seemed to hold its breath. When the questions began, Sammy answered with the same measured voice he had used his whole life. No rushing. No show. He told the story of how the family worked, who gave orders, who carried them out, what loyalty really meant inside the walls of that world. Each word landed heavy. These weren't rumors, weren't whispers from the street. This was the man who had sat in every meeting, who had heard every plan, who had carried out the business with his own hands. And in those words, John Gotti's shield cracked wide open. The boss who once walked out of courtrooms smiling now sat stone-faced, his eyes fixed on the man he had once called his underboss. The Teflon Don, untouchable for so long, was finally being pinned down not by the FBI alone, but by the very man who once stood at his side. Sammy didn't look for revenge in that room. He didn't spit anger or raise his voice. He spoke simply, quietly, like a man laying out the facts of a long, hard life. And maybe that was why the jury listened so closely. For days, his testimony ran on. Each detail added another weight to the case, another chain pulling Gotti down. The press filled pages with his words, calling it betrayal, calling it history. Some saw courage, others saw treachery. But to Sammy it was survival, plain and simple. At night, back in his cell, the noise of the courtroom faded into silence. He lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, knowing he had crossed the line forever. There would be no going back, no quiet return to Bensonhurst, no slipping back into the life he once ruled. The verdict came in April 1992. Guilty on all counts. John Gotti, the man who wore the streets like a crown, was sentenced to life without parole. The courtroom buzzed with the weight of it. Reporters rushed to file their stories. Cameras flashed. And in the middle of it all, Sammy sat still, knowing his testimony had changed everything. The Gambino boss was gone, locked away forever. The family fractured. And Sammy himself was no longer a part of it, not truly. He had chosen a different road, one few in his world ever dared to walk. But the story didn't end there. Survival in one world often meant exile in another. And as Gotti's cell door closed, Sammy's new life was only beginning. When the trial ended and the headlines began to fade, Sammy's life shifted into something he never imagined. No more crowded backrooms filled with smoke. No more construction meetings where envelopes passed hand to hand. No more streets that recognized his walk or nodded at his name.